Early in 1947, Truman adopted the advice of three top advisors in deciding to contain Soviet aggression. His containment policy, which was to govern U.S. foreign policy for decades, was formulated by the Secretary of State, General George Marshall, the Undersecretary of State, Dean Acheson, and an expert on Soviet affairs, George F. Kennan. In an influential article, Kennan had written that only a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies would eventually cause the Soviets to back off their communist ideology of world domination and live in peace with other nations. Did the containment policy attempt to do too much? Among the critics who argued that it did was journalist Walter Lippmann, who had coined the term Cold War. Lippmann argued that some areas were vital to U.S. security, while others were merely peripheral. Some governments deserved U.S. support, but others did not. American leaders, however, had learned the lesson of Munich, when leaders had given in to demands by Hitler for land in 1938, and appeasement well, and felt that communist aggression, wherever it occurred, must be challenged. Truman first implemented the containment policy in response to two threats. One, a communist-led uprising against the government in Greece, and two, Soviet demands for some control of a water route in Turkey. In what became known as the Truman Doctrine, the president asked Congress in March of 1947 for $400 million in economic and military aid to assist the free people of Greece and Turkey against totalitarian regimes. While Truman's alarmist speech may have oversimplified the situation in Greece and Turkey, it gained bipartisan support from Republicans and Democrats in Congress. After the war, Europe lay in ruins, short of food and deep in debt. The harsh winter of 1946 to 1947 further demoralized Europeans who had already suffered through years of depression and war. Discontent encouraged the growth of the Communist Party, especially in France and Italy. The Truman administration feared that the Western democracies might vote the communists into power. In June of 1947, George Marshall outlined an extensive program of U.S. economic aid to help European nations revive their economies and strengthen democratic governments. In December, Truman submitted to Congress a $17 billion European Recovery Program, better known as the Marshall Plan. In 1948, $12 billion in aid was approved for distribution to the countries of Western Europe over a 4-year period. The United States offered Marshall Plan aid to the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites, but the Soviets refused it, fearing that it would lead to dependence on the United States. The Marshall Plan worked exactly as Marshall and Truman had hoped. The massive infusion of U.S. dollars helped Western Europe achieve self-sustaining growth by the 1950s and ended any real threat of communist political successes in that region. It also bolstered U.S. prosperity by greatly increasing U.S. exports to Europe. At the same time, however, it deepened the rift between the non-communist West and the communist East. A major crisis of the Cold War focused on Berlin. In June of 1948, the Soviets cut off all access by land to the German city. Truman dismissed any plans to withdraw from Berlin, but he also rejected using force to open up the roads through the Soviet-controlled Eastern Zone. Instead, he ordered U.S. planes to fly in supplies to the people of West Berlin. Day after day, week after week, the massive airlift continued. At the same time, Truman sent 60 bombers capable of carrying atomic bombs to bases in England. The world waited nervously for the outbreak of war, but Stalin decided not to challenge the airlift. Truman's stand on Berlin was partly responsible for his victory in the 1948 election. By May of 1949, the Soviets finally opened up the highways to Berlin, thus bringing their 11-month blockade to an end. A major long-term consequence of the Berlin crisis was the creation of two Germanys, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, which is, of course, East Germany. Ever since Washington's farewell address in 1796, the United States had avoided permanent alliances with European nations. Truman broke with this tradition in 1949 by recommending that the United States join a military defense pact to protect Western Europe. The Senate readily gave its consent. 10 European nations joined the United States and Canada in creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, a military alliance for defending all members from outside attack. Truman selected General Eisenhower as NATO's first supreme commander and stationed U.S. troops in Western Europe as a deterrent against a Soviet invasion. Thus, the containment policy led to a military buildup and major commitments abroad. The Soviet Union countered in 1955 by forming the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance for the defense of the communist states of Eastern Europe. The United States had begun to modernize its military capability in 1947 by passing the National Security Act. It provided for 1. A centralized Department of Defense, which replaced the War Department, to coordinate the operations of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. 2. The creation of the National Security Council, or the NSC, to coordinate the making of foreign policy in the Cold War. And 3. The creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, to employ spies to gather information on foreign governments. In 1948, the Selective Service System and a peacetime draft were instituted. After the Berlin crisis, teams of scientists in both the Soviet Union and the United States were engaged in an intense competition or arms race to develop superior weapons systems. For a period of just 4 years, 1945 to 1949, the United States was the only nation to have the atomic bomb. It also developed in this period a new generation of long-range bombers for delivering nuclear weapons. The Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in the fall of 1949. Truman then approved the development of a bomb 1,000 times more powerful than the A-bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. In 1952, this hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb, was added to the U.S. arsenal. Earlier in 1950, the National Security Council had recommended in a secret report known as the NSC 68 that the following measures were necessary for fighting the Cold War. Quadruple U.S. government defense spending to 20% of GNP, form alliances with non-communist countries around the world, and convince the American public that a costly arms buildup was imperative for the nation's defense. Since coming to power in the late 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek had used his command of the Nationalist Party to control China's central government. During World War II, the United States had given massive military aid to Chiang to prevent all of China from being conquered by Japan. As soon as the war ended, a civil war dating back to the 1930s was renewed between Chiang's nationalists and the Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong. The nationalists were losing the loyalty of millions of Chinese because of runaway inflation and widespread corruption, while the well-organized communists successfully appealed to the poor landless peasants. The Truman administration sent George Marshall in 1946 to China to negotiate an end to the Civil War, but his compromise fell apart in a few months. By 1947, Chiang's armies were in retreat. Truman seemed unsure of what to do after ruling out a large-scale American invasion to rescue Jiang. In 1948, Congress voted to give the nationalist government $400 million in aid, but 80% of the U.S. military supplies ended up in communist hands because of corruption and the collapse of the nationalist armies. By the end of 1949, all of mainland China was controlled by the communists. Jiang and the nationalists had retreated to an island once under Japanese rule known as Formosa or Taiwan. From there, Jiang still claimed to be the legitimate government for all of China. The United States continued to support Jiang and refused to recognize Mao Zedong's regime in Beijing, the People's Republic of China, until 30 years later in 1979. In the United States, Republicans blamed the Democrats for the loss of China to the communists. In 1950, the two communist dictators, Stalin and Mao, signed the Sino-Soviet Pact, which seemed to provide further proof of a worldwide communist conspiracy. After the defeat of Japan, its former colony Korea was divided along the 38th parallel by the victors. Soviet armies occupied Korean territory north of the line, while U.S. forces occupied territory to the south. By 1949, both armies were withdrawn, leaving the North in the hands of the Communists and the South under the conservative nationalists. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean army surprised the world, possibly even Moscow, by invading South Korea. Truman took immediate action, applying his containment policy to this latest crisis in Asia. He called for a special session of the UN Security Council. Taking advantage of a temporary boycott by the Soviet delegation, the Security Council under the U.S. leadership authorized a UN force to defend South Korea against the invaders. Although other nations participated in this force, UN troops made up the most of the UN forces sent to help the South Korean army. Commanding the expedition was General Douglas MacArthur. Congress supported the use of U.S. troops in the Korean crisis, but failed to declare war, accepting Truman's characterization of U.S. intervention as merely a police action. At first, the war in Korea went badly, as the North Koreans pushed the combined South Korean and American forces to the tip of the peninsula. However, General MacArthur reversed the war with a brilliant amphibious assault in Incheon, behind the North Korean lines. UN forces then proceeded to destroy much of the North Korean army, advancing northward almost as far as the Chinese border. MacArthur failed to heed China's warnings that it would resist threats to its security. In November of 1950, masses of Chinese troops crossed the border into Korea, overwhelmed UN forces in one of the worst defeats in U.S. military history, and drove them out of North Korea. MacArthur stabilized the fighting near the 38th parallel. At the same time, he called for expanding the war, including bombing and invading mainland China. As Commander-in-Chief, Truman cautioned MacArthur about making public statements that suggested criticism of official U.S. policy. The general spoke out anyway. In April of 1951, Truman, with the support of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, recalled MacArthur for insubordination. MacArthur returned home as a hero. Most Americans understood his statement, "There is no substitute for victory," better than the president's containment policy and concept of limited war. Critics attacked Truman and the Democrats as appeasers for not trying to destroy communism in Asia. In Korea, the war was stalemated along a front just north of the 38th parallel. Peace talks began in July 1951. The police action dragged on for another 2 years, however, until an armistice was finally signed in 1953, during the first year of Eisenhower's presidency. More than 2.5 million people died in the Korean conflict, including 54,000 Americans. From the perspective of the grand strategy of the Cold War, Truman's containment policy in Korea worked. It stopped communist aggression without allowing the conflict to develop into a war. The Truman administration used the Korean War as justification for dramatically expanding the military, funding a new jet bomber, which is the B-52, and stationing more U.S. troops in overseas bases. However, Republicans were far from satisfied. The stalemate in Korea and the loss of China led Republicans to characterize Truman and the Democrats as soft on communism. They attacked leading Democrats as members of Dean Achenson's cowardly College of Communist Containment. In 1949, Achenson had replaced George Marshall as Secretary of State. Just as a Red Scare had followed U.S. victory in World War I, a second Red Scare followed U.S. victory in World War II. The Truman administration's tendency to see a communist conspiracy behind civil wars in Europe and Asia contributed to the belief that communist conspirators and spies had infiltrated American society, including the U.S. State Department and the U.S. military. In the House of Representatives, the Un-American Activities Committee, originally established in 1939 to seek out Nazis, was reactivated in the post-war years to find communists. The committee not only investigated government officials, but also looked for communist influence in such organizations as the Boy Scouts and in the Hollywood film industries. Actors, directors, and writers were called before the committee to testify. Those who refused to testify were tried for contempt of Congress. Others were blacklisted from the industry. Joseph McCarthy, a Republican senator from Wisconsin, used the growing concern over communism in his re-election campaign. In a speech in 1950, he charged that 205 communists were still working for the State Department. This sensational accusation was widely publicized in the American press. McCarthy then rode the wave of anti-communist feelings to make himself one of the most powerful men in America. His power was based entirely on people's fear of the damage McCarthy could do if his accusing finger pointed their way. Senator McCarthy used a steady stream of unsupported accusations about communists in government to keep the media focused on himself and to discredit the Truman administration. Working class Americans at first loved the take off the gloves, hard-hitting remarks, which were often aimed at the wealthy and privileged in society. While many Republicans disliked McCarthy's ruthless tactics, he was primarily hurting the Democrats before the election of Eisenhower in 1952. He became so popular, however, that even President Eisenhower would not dare to defend his old friend George Marshall against McCarthy's untruths. Finally, in 1954, McCarthy's reckless cruelty was exposed on television. A Senate committee held televised hearings on communist infiltration in the Army, and McCarthy was seen as a bully by millions of viewers. In December, Republicans joined Democrats in a Senate censure of McCarthy. The witch hunt for communists, or also known as McCarthyism by the press, had played itself out. 3 years later, McCarthy died a broken man. Now for the essential question. Who started the Cold War? Use evidence to support your arguments.